Throughout Ford's really long history, they've introduced a bunch of different engines, and most notably a bunch of different V8 engines that have powered their most popular cars, from the Mustang, the Ford GT, the F-150, the Bronco, and so on. Really, the V8 engine is a big part of their heritage, of their lineage, as it is with most US-based manufacturers. If you look at GM or Mopar, V8's a big part of their history. And that kind of got me thinking, out of all the V8s that Ford has ever made throughout all these years, which ones are the best? So sit back, get comfy, and get your popcorn, because today we're going to look at the best V8 engines ever produced by Ford. To start this off, we have to rewind the clock way back, close to the very start of the V8 engine in the US. And although Ford wasn't the first to bring a V8 to the US, that goes to Cadillac, Ford is mostly responsible for making the V8 so popular, and they did that with the flathead V8. Unlike many of the other V8 engines available at this time, the flathead was special in the fact that it was specifically designed to be easy to produce and much more affordable than any other options. Ford did this by continually simplifying the design until they had something that was so simple and so reliable that Henry Ford himself checked off on it. The flathead engine features a one-piece cast iron block, as opposed to some of the other V8 engines of the time, which actually feature a multi-piece block. Many of the simplifications that Ford made to the flathead were in order to improve things such as piston wear and oil consumption, ultimately to improve the longevity of the engine. By today's standards, the flathead is a pretty pathetic motor in terms of power output, with power initially coming in at 65 horsepower, but eventually being increased to 85 horsepower. And by the time World War II finally ended, there were multiple versions of the flathead available for different sorts of applications, ranging from passenger cars all the way up to commercial trucks. The flathead's involvement in the World War is part of the reason that it became so popular in the hot rod world, because as these guys were coming back from overseas, as these servicemen were returning, they wanted to tinker with something. And what better to tinker with than something that you had experience with overseas in the war? Ultimately, the flathead became one of the more preferred powertrains of hot rod culture in California and all over the US. Really, it's not even an exaggeration to say that the flathead V8 was basically the foundation of hot rodding as we know it today. Without this engine, it really would have not been the same. And with that also spawned the first ever real aftermarket for a car. The flathead was one of, if not the first engine that saw mass support with companies making parts for it and making it easy to modify without custom making your own parts. While the flathead is great and very cool and very important to the history of the V8 engine and Ford, it's a little underwhelming in terms of performance. So let's take a look at the next engine on the list, which offers a ton of performance. More specifically, let's take a look at the 427 big block, which is by far Ford's most famous and well-known big block engine ever. When you boil it down, the 427 is effectively a bored-out version of the 390 cubic inch FE V8 engine, but it also features loads of improvements for more power output. And although the 427 was really designed to dominate motorsports, and more specifically NASCAR, it was something that you could order and select Ford cars when new. The rare street cars that received this giant engine were treated with tons of power, to the tune of 425 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. But on the track, things were even better, as Ford upped the power even further with improvements such as high-rise and mid-rise heads. There's also the famed 427 cammer, which ditched the overhead valve design in favor of a single overhead cam design. Unfortunately, this specific engine never really caught on, as NASCAR wouldn't let the engine in any car unless that specific car also had a 430-pound ballast to offset the additional power, which ultimately no one ever took up. Of course, outside of NASCAR, the 427 also had a massive success in sports car racing, most notably winning Le Mans in the Ford GT40 in 1966. Unfortunately, very few street cars ended up with this engine when new, because of the crazy price of the engine made many of the cars unaffordable. Besides that, the 427 was really only available for big cars like the Ford Galaxy or the Mercury Marauder. Overall though, the 427 really put Ford on the map in terms of motorsports and let the world know that Ford meant business, which leads me to the next engine on the list, which is another engine specifically designed for racing, and that's the Boss 302. Because 302 is in the name of the Boss 302, a lot of people automatically assume that it's not anything particularly special, because every other 5-liter V8 from Ford is also a 302. Despite that, the Boss 302 is very interesting and very special because it was also designed with motorsports in mind, just like the 427 was. This time around though, the focus was on Trans Am racing. The Boss 302 engine uses a taller block and a high-performance rotating assembly with forged connecting rods. It also features sodium-filled exhaust valves, forged pistons, and a pretty big camshaft. The result is actually surprisingly underpowered when you consider those aforementioned modifications at just 290 horsepower and 290 pound-feet of torque, but Ford didn't build the Boss 302 for making big power. Rather, it was built for sustained high RPM usage. On the track, the Boss 302 could hold 8,000 RPM all day long without any issues, and this engine found its way into both the Mercury Cougar and the Ford Mustang in the 1969 and 1970 Trans Am series. Really, the performance of this engine is so good that it helped them take home the Manufacturer series in 1970. Unfortunately, the Boss 302 Mustang was only around for 2 years, 1969 and 1970. I think it's also worth noting that the actual casting for this engine is much different than the standard 302, so don't think of it as just a hopped up 302. It genuinely was and is a special engine in Ford's history. That takes us forward in time to the late 1970s, where the Windsor engine was struggling a bit in terms of power output, so Ford introduced a newer, more modern, and more powerful version of the 5-liter and dubbed it the 5-liter high output. Now, the first versions of this new high output 5-liter engine came out in 1982 and offered a whopping 157 horsepower, but that was eventually bumped up to 225 horsepower throughout the years. On initial release, it was still carbureted, but in 1986, Ford introduced electronic fuel injection, and that's partially what made this engine so legendary. For the first time ever, Ford was offering their well-known and loved Windsor engine with electronic fuel injection. Gone was the need for swapping to a larger carb when you built your engine. Gone was the need for messing with your carb when you changed an elevation. Gone was all the annoying stuff that happens with carbureted motors, and now everything was smoothly and reliably controlled by a computer. And similarly to the flathead V8, the 5-liter high output was very quickly adopted by the aftermarket and is now one of the largest aftermarkets out there for any V8 ever. Personally, I think a lot of people really like the 5-liter high output because of how loved the Fox Body Mustang is. But regardless, this engine helped Ford get into the electronic fuel injection market and the modern age, and it really helped put them on the map in terms of modern performance engines. Last, but certainly not least, we have the Coyote, which is what I personally consider to be Ford's greatest V8 engine ever. Sure, it doesn't have the racing heritage of the Boss 302 or the 427, but just hear me out. It's their most powerful engine ever in terms of power per liter. It's their most advanced V8 engine ever. It's their most reliable V8 engine ever. And most importantly, it's an incredible platform with very strong aftermarket support, and Ford has built on it with multiple iterations because of how good the base platform of the Coyote is. Now, the Coyote came right after the death of the 5-liter high output, which is when Ford introduced the mod motor family, but kept the Mustang as a 4.6-liter rather than a 5-liter. The Coyote is derived from the modular family and brought back the 5-liter displacement that we all know and love in the Mustang. The Coyote was the first Ford V8 engine to feature twin variable camshaft timing on both the intake and the exhaust camshafts. And the aluminum block was webbed rather than reinforced in order to give it way more strength. It also features entirely new heads that shared almost nothing with the 3-valve heads that came before it, other than the fact that it shares the overhead camshaft design. Upon initial release, the Coyote's output was rated at 420 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque, which was a massive increase as compared to the 5-liter high output and even the 4.6-liter 3-valve modular motor. Hell, it's even a massive step up compared to the 4.6-liter 4-valve modular motor. But throughout the years, Ford has continued to innovate with the Coyote, bumping power up to 435 horsepower and then 460 horsepower, and finally 480 horsepower in the newest high-performance Mustang variants such as the Bullet and the Mach 1. In terms of special variants of the Coyote, there's the Boss 302 Roadrunner engine, the Voodoo 5.2-liter flat-plane crank engine, and the supercharged Predator engine. Simply put, the Coyote is an incredible base engine that Ford did an amazing job of squeezing performance out of. Sure, you can definitely get more power out of a Coyote with the right parts and the right tuning, but for the most part, Ford did a great job of cranking the Coyote to its absolute limits in naturally aspirated form, and that's what makes this engine so special. It's a 5-liter that outputs nearly 500 horsepower, which is 100 horsepower per liter, which is by far their most power efficient engine ever. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a comment down below. Let me know what engine is your favorite V8 engine from Ford. Like I said, I think it's a Coyote. I think it's the most modern, the most fuel efficient, the most power efficient, the most advanced, and just simply the best V8 engine ever from Ford. Doesn't have the heritage of other engines, but it's better in basically any other way. Be sure to smash the thumbs up button because it really helps me out. Get subscribed so you don't miss out on future videos. Check out some of the other videos on the channel because we have a ton of videos covering a ton of different things, and I'm sure you'll love them. And I'll see you guys in the next one.